coast of Florida, and all of those data go into the federal stock assessments. We also do a lot of deep sea work that I'll touch on at the end of this, mostly related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but in the Bahamas and up the East Coast and other places as well. And then we do a lot of work on small tooth sawfish, which I'll talk to you a little bit about today. But all of the work that we do is essentially ecological work that fills in gaps needed for either fisheries management or conservation. We have a diverse fauna of sharks in this region, in the state of Florida. You may not realize that of the 1,200 species of sharks and rays, we have about 100 of them, a little over 100 of them in the state of Florida. In the coastal zone, there's about 25 species of sharks, and they're dominated by these galeomorph requiem sharks in this area. In the pelagic zone, you tend to get a few species of lamniform sharks and mackerel sharks, but it's a diverse coastal fauna. We also have a diverse batoid fauna, the hashtag flat sharks, you know, the pancake sharks. So basically the ones that are flat, and they're sharks too. They're just, they don't get the respect, as you'll see. About 20 species of coastal batoids as well. These are dominated by the myelobatiform stingrays, one species of electric ray, a few species of skates, one guitarfish, and of course a sawfish that I'm going to talk about. And then in the deep sea, we have an incredibly diverse fauna of deep sea sharks as well. Over 30 species. We're finding new ones all the time, dominated by the squalomorphs, the dogfishes, gulper sharks and their relatives and things like that, as well as a nice suite of cat sharks. But it's a diverse array of cool sharks. Not too many species of deep water batoids off the state of Florida. I should mention that, of course, none of these deep water taxa occur in state waters, because when I refer to deep water, I mean deeper than 200 meters, and we pretty much don't have any depths that deep within state waters. But they're still within the eastern Gulf of Mexico and along the East Coast. The deep water is dominated batoid-wise by skates. Worldwide, anywhere you have batoids in cool water, it's skates. And so we have a pretty cool array of skates that are found down. These are among our deepest elasmobranchs. This species here, Rhyella purpuraventralis, we get it down to 1,800 meters deep. So it's a deep critter. So a little background, globally, shark landings increased about threefold over the last half of the 20th century. They peaked in about 2000, and since that time have come down. There's a neat paper by Nick Dolvey and Lucy Harrison that details what that decline there is about. It's partially due to more and more aggressive management. It's partially due to overfishing. It's a combined effect. When people think of shark fisheries and shark landings, they automatically go to thinking about shark fins. But it's important to realize that actually shark fins and shark meat are actually about equal in terms of overall value, fisheries value, commodities worldwide. This is basically thousands of tons and US dollars for the whole global market. And the take home is that both the meat market and the fin market are worth about $400 million each. So it's about an $800 million industry worldwide. Of course, these are landings, so these are directed fisheries, those that are actually they're catching them. And there's a huge problem, of course, with bycatch. We have this problem with many different taxa. And so there's an article I wrote not too long ago for Save Our Seas magazine on the sort of details that goes over in broad terms the different sources of bycatch by fishery and which taxa of elasmobranchs are affected by those fisheries. Most people know that in the U.S., trawl fisheries, bottom trawl fisheries, are by far are responsible for most of the bycatch. We discard around 1 million metric tons of fish every year in the U.S. From bycatch, and about 72% of that is from trawls. Long lines get a bad rap, but they only contribute about 3.9% of that. But still, that's not negligible. And so when we start doing the stock assessments, I've been on the CDAR panel of experts for a number of years participating in the stock assessments, and anytime we do a small coastal shark stock assessment, the overall landings in those stock assessments for the small coastal shark complex, things like sharpnose, blacknose, and bonnetheads, is dominated by shrimp trawl bycatch. That makes up, everything else is dwarfed. Everything else is meaningless. It's really just shrimp trawl bycatch that affects those stock assessments. But longline's important too, not just pelagic longline, but also demersal longline. I don't expect you to be able to read that, but this is a list from observer data of the taxa captured in the mixed reef fish longline, bottom longline fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. And you see there's a huge number of taxa there. Only 3 of the top 10 species caught there are the ones that are actually targeted, and about 70% of what's caught is discarded. Importantly, there are 15 species of sharks on that list. And all of the ones that are listed here in red are ones that are actually prohibited from harvest, either because they have very vulnerable life histories or because they are overfished, but they're caught as bycatch in this bottom longline fishery for snappers and groupers and tilefish. So that's important to keep in mind. Of course, the problem that we have, the challenge, one of the major challenges with the sharks and rays, the elasmobranch fishes, is that they are, in the classic terms, case-selected. They all have internal fertilization, and they have low fecundity. There's a big group of skates and a big group of cat sharks that are egg layers, but by and large, the sharks that are captured in fisheries, and the rays for that matter that are captured in fisheries, give live birth. And many of them are matrotrophic, meaning they either have a yolk sac placenta that they get uterine milk from mom, or they use other things called trophonemata in some of the stingrays. But basically, it's a very advanced form of embryonic development that means that you have to have low fecundity in order for the mom to be able to give the energy that's needed to the embryos. So they're extremely extremely conservative life histories. The term life in a slow lane that Jack Musick sort of coined for this type of embryonic development, he pointed out that the intrinsic rates of natural increase for these sharks and rays are actually very low and more comparable to what we see for whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and even elephants than they are for most bony fishes. And so that means that we need to manage them differently than we manage most of our bony fishes. And that's what got us in trouble in the early days of fisheries for sharks. So you can imagine, in a really simple way, a pelagic longline fishery that's targeting tuna, yellowfin or bigeye, for example. The target species matures in 2 to 3 years, produces millions of eggs, and has a population doubling time of 2 years. But then if the bycatch in that fishery, even if it's a low level, if the bycatch is a dusky shark that matures in 20 years, has 12 pups on a triannual cycle, only every 3 years, with a 30-year population doubling time, you're going to get into trouble pretty quickly if you're catching this as bycatch while targeting that. This basically shows intrinsic rebound potentials for different species of fishes versus age at maturity. The dotted lines are pelagic teleos, which are usually the targets in some of these fisheries, and the solid lines are sharks. Small coastal and pelagic sharks tend to have slightly faster life histories, but their intrinsic rebound potentials are still much lower than those tunas and billfish. And of course, the large coastal sharks have among the lowest intrinsic rebound potentials of any vertebrates. And so if you are fishing for these and you're catching these, you're going to overfish these very, very quickly down here. But even among the sharks, there's a lot of variation in life history. This just pay attention to the far right column. This is population doubling time of a whole suite of sharks. And you can see it varies from sharks like smoothhounds and sharpnose that can double in about 5 or 6 years to dusky sharks and spiny dogfish that double in 30 to 40 years. So there's even a lot of disparity within the sharks. Now, I showed you the trend in landings worldwide. This is the trends in landing by the U.S. in Western Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico waters. What you can see is there was virtually no fishery, a very small fishery for sharks, up until when we opened trade with China in 1979. That opened the fin trade, and then there was an exponential increase in landings of coastal sharks right here to supply that fin trade. That fishery has always been predominantly in the state of Florida. 60% of the revenue in 2001, it's a $5 million fishery. 60% of the revenue was in Florida. The rest either elsewhere in the Gulf or elsewhere in the Atlantic, mostly North Carolina and Louisiana. Now this decline here in landings isn't actually due to population decline directly. This fishery was really targeted at sandbar sharks. Sandbar sharks dominated. They have these huge grade 1 fins for shark fin soup, and so they made up about 2/3 of the directed landings in this directed commercial shark fishery. Now, sandbar sharks are primarily, this is basically a lot of my dissertation work, I'll summarize in here. This summarizes 6,000 sharks that we tagged, sandbar sharks we tagged. The biggest nurseries are Delaware Bay and especially Chesapeake Bay. That's where pupping takes place. And as juveniles, they basically just use the mid-Atlantic bite. But then as adults, they start to migrate south. And as adults, they use both sides of Florida. In fact, the males sometimes stay resident on the Gulf Coast, in the Gulf, on the shelf edge on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And this is where we believe mating takes place, and they may stay resident there. Importantly, they get exposed to different fisheries along this entire route and across their ontogeny, which makes them very vulnerable to overfishing. So for a number of years, I ran a survey, and Jim Gelsider was part of it too, that Jack Music started in Virginia. It was started in the 70s, a fishery independent longline survey to assess relative abundance of coastal sharks. These are the landings the catch rates of sandbar sharks from the 70s through the early 90s. There's precipitous decline. We estimated that the populations probably declined by 80 or 90% during that period. These are those landings in that directed fishery. At the same time, there was an equal size recreational fishery associated with this stock. So this was recognized early on as being a big problem. These populations were collapsing. And so fortunately, in 1993, the first federal fishery management plan for sharks was implemented. And it basically, right off the bat, set a quota that cut the landings by 75% right off the bat. So that's where a lot of that decline after 1992 comes from, decline in landings. It basically established a quota, counted state and federal landings together. It prohibited vulnerable species, 5 of them in 96, 19 of them in 1999. Also implemented some time area closures and a habitat area of particular concern. And these different changes here are basically due to subsequent stock assessments to try to sustainably manage this stock. Of course, all along the way, lawsuits galore. So, for example, after we finished the 1999 Shark Evaluation Workshop and put up the new FMP that was going to drop this by about 30% right here, immediately the Secretary of the Department of Commerce was sued by 3 fishing industry groups, fishing interest groups. And so a federal judge enjoined NOAA from enforcing those quotas that science said we should enforce. And so then following that in 1992, NOAA NEMS was sued by 3 different environmental groups for basically not enforcing the regulations they're not allowed by law to enforce. And so you can see that the regulators are caught in the middle here trying to manage this fishery. Nevertheless, it's widely held up now as one of the best managed shark fisheries in the world. And we have one of the most sustainably managed shark fisheries in the world, and our landings are about 8% of what peak was. Not because that's how many are out there, but because that's where it's regulated at now. Importantly, it varies across taxa and across life histories. And in very general terms, if the population doubling time is between 5 and 7 years, the populations are healthy. If it's between 12 and 15 years, some of these, like bull sharks and blacktips, may have been overfished at one point, but they've fully recovered now. But we still have problems with those, the population doubling times over 25 years. Sandbar sharks are still overfished, but with no overfishing occurring. Dusky sharks both are overfished and overfishing is occurring. So we still have some issues there, but things are looking better. Unfortunately, we hit what I like to call the Chicken Little doom and gloom era in fisheries and ecological science, where a lot of papers came out where they basically cherry-picked data sets to show dramatic declines without even acknowledging these stock assessments that were much more robust with many more data sets in them. And there have been many, many rebuttals to these papers, some of them up to 11 rebuttals, and we've been part of some of them. I don't want to go into those, but I do want to point out one of them. This one by Myers et al. In 2007 on trophic cascades. Basically what this paper said was that declines, it used a single data set to say that huge declines in large coastal sharks had, due to predation release, had led to exponential increases in small sharks and rays, especially cownose rays. And then on top of that, cownose rays, by increasing exponentially, the hyperabundant cownose rays, they said, were enough to cause the collapse of shellfish fisheries along the east coast of the U.S. And this got picked up immediately. It's been cited 1,200 times, this paper, already. And these data have been parroted in other papers over and over again. It's even been used as a case study in a textbook on trophic cascades. The problem is it's BS on all levels. And so we actually published a rebuttal last year assessing this trophic cascade, basically asking, are these declines as severe as reported? We knew they weren't because of the stock assessments. Are these increases, particularly for cownose rays, are they biologically realistic? Do these things eat these enough for trophic release to cause this increase to begin anyway? And then also, are the cownose rays responsible for the collapse of shellfish stocks? Anybody who knows anything about shellfish knows that overfishing and disease is the primary reason shellfish stocks have collapsed. I'm not going to touch on all of those today. The answer to all those questions is no. If you want to know why, read the paper. But I do want to touch on this one. Is the increase in cownose ray abundance credible? So we completed a pretty robust life history study of cownose rays, figured out that we aged over 500 vertebrae, found out they mature in about 7 years, live to 20 years or so. But most importantly, they have a 12-month gestation period and they produce one pup each year. If you produce one pup per year, chances are if you had zero mortality, you're not going to, predation mortality, you're not going to increase exponentially, your population isn't. And we actually found that cownose rays are among the least productive of all elasmobranch fishes. They have a lower reproductive rate, this is the finite rate of population increase, than all of the large coastal sharks that supposedly eat them. One of the tenets of trophic cascades is that the predator has to reproduce slower than the prey, and that's not the case here at all. These things are among our most vulnerable elasmobranch fishes. Unfortunately, this paper, the Myers et al. Paper, gave ammo to the fishing industry in Chesapeake Bay particularly to start a fishery for cownose rays, our most vulnerable elasmobranch. And they named it Chesapeake ray because cownose doesn't sound appetizing. They called it the veal of the sea because it doesn't look like fish, so they can't call it fish. They got to call it veal. And you can go online and you could buy it, and they started this big fishery. It even started showing up in like the Boston Seafood Show. This is in the Brussels Seafood Show. Chesapeake ray started showing up. Importantly, it's not Chesapeake ray. This is a highly migratory species, so any management is going to require interjurisdictional management. This thing basically spends its summer up in the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay regions, but it's down here in Florida, off the east coast of Florida, in the winter. And we have another different population, actually 2 species over here in the Gulf of Mexico as well. But unfortunately, this led to not only directed fisheries in Chesapeake Bay, but also the spawning of bow fishing for these cownose rays and bow fishing tournaments. And there were green restaurants selling cownose ray as a sustainable thing to do. This is how you save the bay, is eating cownose ray. These tournaments popped up, and these are all this is just wanton waste in my mind. I'm a hunter, and this appalls me, because they just leave them there, that nothing happens to them. They purposely had the tournaments right before they pup, so that they're killing the females with their one pup. And so this is a big problem right here on top of that. And it's not limited to Virginia, by the way. These are Florida websites here. And cownose rays, our most vulnerable elasmobranch in coastal waters, are completely unregulated, except for they're an unregulated species, meaning you can legally take 2 per day or 100 pounds. But most people don't keep them. Most of the bow fishermen go out and they kill them and they leave them. And there's multiple TV shows I've seen on outdoor channels in the last year of people targeting cownose rays. Fortunately, we got a lot of press for that rebuttal. Cownose rays, ray fillets won't save the bay. Cownose rays acquitted. So hopefully this will have an effect in the long run, but we'll see. It's important because what we've seen in the IUCN Shark Specialist Group is that if you look at the most imperiled families of sharks and rays, it's actually rays, not sharks. You know, tiger sharks are fine. White sharks are fine. It's the rays like sawfish and guitarfish and some of the stingrays that are the problem. And so we need to be looking into this. And so that brings me to the next topic, which are sawfish, considered the most imperiled of all chondrichthyan families of fishes. All 5 species are listed as endangered or critically endangered. And so we've been doing research I've been involved since 2011 or 2010, doing research to promote recovery of small-tooth sawfish. These are all the collaborators from all the different agencies and things. Everybody with an underline, including me, we're part of the NOAA sawfish recovery team right now. So what caused sawfish declines? Commercial fishing in the teens and 20s in the Florida Keys, recreational targeting, especially in the 50s through the 70s, bycatch, of course, again, always a huge issue, especially in shrimp trawls. There have been a number of conservation actions to potentially protect sawfish. This includes sawfish were protected in Florida in 1992. Gill nests were banned in 95. All 5 species, this doesn't have any kind of regulatory oomph, but all 5 species were listed as endangered or critically endangered by the IUCN. 2003, small-tooth sawfish became the first native marine fish listed as endangered under the ESA in the United States. Critical habitat was designated in 2009, basically 2 areas where we know there are a lot of juveniles. The Charlotte Harbor, Caloosahatchee, Peace River area, where FWC does a lot of research on juvenile sawfish, and then the 10,000 Islands through the Everglades National Park, where NOAA and my group do a lot of work on juveniles. We also do a lot of work on adults. This shows the distribution of our longline sets, trying to catch adults to figure out where they go and where are the greatest interactions with commercial fisheries, particularly shrimp trawls. All the green dots are a longline set. All the little bubbles are where we've caught sawfish at some point. And so I put a little video in here just to show you how we catch sawfish. And so it's a fishery independent longline. We set out 50 hooks, and it stays out for exactly 1 hour to minimize any mortality on sharks, because we catch 50 sharks for every sawfish. Obviously, once you get the sawfish, you've got to get it restrained. These things are incredibly strong. We regularly catch them up to 4.5 meters long, so they're big animals. There are holes all in the gel coat of my boat from the teeth. There's a tooth lodged 1 inch deep in one of my engines. You can see this one here almost killed me. Coming up right here, right there, he almost killed me. And so we measure them, take photos, take genetic samples, stabilized stope samples. We take blood for reproductive hormones that Jim Gelsider is working on, and we also do stress physiology with them. And then we either implant them with an acoustic transmitter now, or in these days we were attaching satellite, pop-off archival satellite tags to them. And you'll see right here in a second, I'm going to drill a hole through a critically endangered species. It took 5 years to get permission to do that. But notice it didn't flinch at all, because there's no vascularization in that part, and so they're just fine. So we put the satellite tag on them and then let them go. And so when I started this work, I didn't think I'd ever actually catch a sawfish. We've actually caught up to 6 in 1 hour on 2 different occasions, big adults. And we catch them mostly in Florida Bay in the murky water. And that's places where that's a crocodile, not an alligator. And so whenever I'm in the water like that, I've got my head on a swivel. That's a conservation success story there, the American crocodile. And then we catch them on the edge of the continental shelf on the middle to lower Florida Keys. And we're also doing a lot of reproductive work on them. There's Jim doing an ultrasound on one we caught. We finally found mating grounds this past year, and found areas where they were all marked up with mating scars. But one of the coolest things I want to point out to you is we had one of the coolest happenings in this past December. We were in the Bahamas, and prior to this, there had never been observed whether there was actual pupping going on in the Bahamas, and so we wanted to we'd been going there for about 5 years to see if there was pupping, and you'll see here it's a big animal, 429 centimeters long, and when we flip her over here, I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit if it'll let me. It's my student getting blood real quick it won't let me, getting blood real quick for stable isotopes and stress physiology and reproductive hormones. But when we flip her over, you notice there's something happening right there. And those are 2 rostra of baby sawfish trying to get out. This is something that's never been observed in the wild anywhere in the world. And so I was afraid they would get injured while we were trying to implant a transmitter in the mom, and so I wanted to help them out, that were trying to come out. So I got to play midwife for sawfish, and the first person ever to do that. And look how cute. I mean, that's pretty freaking cute, right? Right there. They don't get much cuter than that. So there were 5 pups in there. If you want to hear more about that, I'll tell you more about that story later. But very adorable little baby sawfish. To end the sawfish story, we've actually started implanting transmitters, and we now have sawfish. One of the things we want to see are sawfish expanding outside of Florida. We have our tag sawfish detected on FACT arrays and ACT arrays of receivers all the way up into Georgia. And all of our fishery independent surveys now suggest that all of our indices suggest that the population is recovering, slowly, but it's recovering. And then the last thing on sawfish is that this is the one of the fortunate things. The 2 places there are sawfish, in southwest Florida and the west coast of Andros, are also places where there are national parks that are protecting the majority of the habitat for sawfish. So we think that they are indeed recovering. All of the Twitters going out of people catching them and mishandling them, even though we don't want to see them mishandling them, that suggests that they are recovering. And I'll probably have to end there because you said I'm out of time, right? 2 minutes. All right, 2 minutes. Deep water sharks, what about them? Why do we care? They're way cool. Look at these little tiny 10-centimeter lantern sharks and these big 6 gills. Cool animals. Even though deep water sharks make up half of the diversity of sharks in the world, they're less than 5% of the directed studies. Bycatch is where we get most of our information on sharks. Thanks to some Florida Restore Act money and Montgomery money, we've been studying the oil spill effects on the deep water sharks for some time, showing a peak in toxicological exposure about 2.5 to 3 years after the oil spill. We caught the first Greenland shark ever caught in the Gulf of Mexico. The coolest thing about it, it's not a Greenland shark. It's a hybrid between a Greenland shark and a Pacific sleeper shark. What the heck? We discovered a new species that we named after Jeannie Clark from Mote Marine Lab, Squalus clarkii. We're getting life history information, but most importantly, what we know is that the most conservative life histories, even more conservative than the Kaunos ray, are these deep water sharks. Extremely conservative life histories. For example, the most common gulper shark that we catch in the Gulf of Mexico, we've aged them to 76 years old. We think they take 20 plus years to reach maturity. They have 1 pup born probably every 3 years. Incredibly conservative life histories. Yet these things are also caught in these mixed species bottom longline fisheries. And we know from some post-release mortality work we did that the post-release survival is nil, and so all of these things are pretty much dying. See, there's 5 seconds left, right? Yeah. So, all right, thank you. Anybody have a question?
In your studies, do you think the value of a shark live anymore? I mean, because diving like sharks is like a multi-million-dollar industry for the state of Florida.
So there are a lot of people doing that work. We haven't been doing that. There are a lot of other people that are doing that. And of course, there's a lot of papers out there that suggest a live shark's worth a lot more than a dead shark for sure. Yeah, depending on where you are. Of course, a sandbar shark, in Chesapeake Bay, nobody cares. Yeah.
On the sawfish between Andros and Florida, is that all one population, or have you done genetics on
So we're doing the genetics work now. That was the whole goal of us originally going over there, because the endangered species listing assumes that the U.S. population is a distinct population. To get between the two, of course, they got to go across the Straits of Florida, 800 meters deep, 6 degrees Celsius. The lowest temperature we've seen them at is 16, 17. So they'd have to do it pelagically to survive it. So far, we've satellite tagged about 60 of these things. Only about 7 in the Bahamas, the rest in Florida, but none of them, those satellite tag ones, have gone across. And we also have receiver arrays in Florida, in the Bahamas, as well as ones in Florida. We've tagged a lot of animals in both places. So far, we've got none of them going across. So we think they're separate populations. Yeah.
I didn't get to ask you this when I mentioned the AFS.
Uh-oh. What's what?
The squalus acanthus occur in Florida?
No.
Okay, so you agree with us.
Yeah, no, it does not. You see it all the time, but what usually gets called Squalus acanthus is what was called Squalus mitsukuri, which was described in Japan as a species complex worldwide. That's the one we just named after Jeannie Clark. The paper's coming out any time, and it's going to be Squalus clarkii. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Dean.
Mm-hmm.
All right.